In 2010, the unthinkable happened. A bench player made the All-Star game. Did he deserve it? This is the story of how a bench player became an All-Star in 2010, thanks to an All-Star game that happened nearly 10 years earlier, and how favoritism made sure he wasn't even the worst All-Star on the team. But before we talk about the player who made the All-Star game, we need to talk about how All-Star selections happen. Every year, MLB.com releases the fan vote ballot. This will include each starter on every team, so if you're a Nationals fan, your team ballot will include Juan Soto, and it will include Lane Thomas. Under the voting system, the player with the most votes at each position becomes the starter. So if you're Juan Soto, and you have the most votes in right field, congratulations, you've made the All-Star team. However, if you're Ronald Acuna Jr. and you finish second, I've got bad news for you. While the fan vote determines the starting position players, it doesn't determine the bench or even the pitchers. If Ronald Acuna Jr. wants to make the All-Star game, he's gonna have to survive a different kind of vote. Since 2017, the reserves and pitchers are determined by two different voting systems. The first is the players vote. Other major leaguers will vote on which of their peers is most deserving of an All-Star bid. 17 of the 32 players in each league are determined this way. The final 6 players are determined by the commissioner's office. This method is actually better than letting fans choose every All-Star. Here's why. By having fans only elect a portion of the All-Stars, you prevent fans from stuffing the ballots and having their entire team make the Midsummer Classic. This has happened before, and very recently in fact. Back in 2015, Royals fans, fresh off their World Series appearance, stuffed the ballots for Royals players. At one point, 7 of the 9 players in first place were Royals. One of the 2 players who weren't in first place, second baseman Omar Infante, was second in voting, and this was despite having a 279 on base percentage and having an OPS under 600. Had the fan vote determined the entire All-Star team, you would have had a guy on the bench who was hitting 43% worse than league average, representing the best of the best. Having players in the commissioner's office choose All-Stars allows for more parity. However, I did mention that this has been the way selections have worked since 2017. What changed? It wasn't a free-for-all before 2017, but it wasn't the commissioner's office choosing players. Instead, it was the All-Star manager. Why the change? Let's go all the way back to 2002 for an explanation. But before we do that, I should explain how All-Star managers are selected. If you aren't familiar with how the process works, it's actually pretty simple. It's been tradition for the managers of the World Series team to take the reign of the Midsummer Classic teams the following year. In 2001, the Diamondbacks defeated the Yankees to take home the World Series trophy, so the following year, the managers of the Midsummer Classic were Joe Torre and Bob Brenly. Both teams had stacked rosters and looked primed to repeat, as the Yankees were tied for the second best record in all of baseball, and the Diamondbacks were just 2.5 games back in the NL West and had the 3rd best record in the National League altogether. When it came to All-Star selections, however, some people were not pleased with the reserve selections. Washington Post columnist Thomas Boswell blasted both managers for perceived favoritism, citing picks like Robin Ventura, Junior Spivey, and Damian Miller over players like Pudge Rodriguez, Roberto Alomar, Albert Pujols, and Larry Walker, just to name a few. But the thing is, some of the players Boswell cited were actually having pretty solid years. Junior Spivey was having the season of his life, hitting .328 with a .552 slugging at the All-Star break, and was the best second baseman in all of baseball. Yeah, Spivey was Brenly's own player, but thinking he didn't deserve the pick isn't the smartest of takes. Of course, I'm not going to say managers never favorite their own players. In fact, I know that's not true, and I'm going to show you an example of a player who was blatantly a product of favoritism. But removing the manager definitely seemed to remove some of the criticism over All-Star selections, even if it was undeserved. Sometimes, however, criticisms over manager selections weren't even about the manager's own player, and that's the focus of today's video. In 2010, Phillies manager Charlie Manuel's most controversial pick wasn't even on his own team. He was on his rivals. If I were to just show you this player's batting line, you might not think the pick was so terrible. After all, there were only so many players who had over 300, especially over the past few decades. No, the issue wasn't the batting line, it was the number of plate appearances. See, Atlanta Braves infielder Omar Infante had 47 fewer plate appearances than anyone else on the All-Star roster, and 80 fewer plate appearances than anyone who wasn't a catcher or a pitcher. Why? Because Infante wasn't even a starter on his own team. But wait, Omar Infante? Remember him? Omar Infante was second in voting, and this was despite having a 279 on base percentage and having an OPS under 600. Unlike in 2015 when he finished second in All-Star voting, Infante wasn't even on the ballot in 2010. This is what the Braves ballot looked like that year, so why would Charlie Manuel pick a rival bench player to be in the All-Star game? Let's back up again to 2002. If you don't remember anything from an All-Star game that happened 20 years ago, I don't blame you. But this All-Star game is directly responsible for numerous changes that happened to the Midsummer Classic. In addition to the rostering controversy, the game itself was a wild one. From the first inning when Torii Hunter robbed a home run, to the back and forth game that saw the National League go up by as much as 4 runs, to the AL coming back and taking a 6-5 lead before the National League came back and tied it after the 8th inning. If this was a normal game, the game would have gone until there was a winner, but this was the All-Star game. After the 11th inning when Benito Santiago struck out and kept the game tied, the commissioner called it a game. The problem? Both teams had run out of pitchers. Fans were furious with the result of the game, which spurred MLB to make a host of changes. Some through rules, some through strategy. One of the changes was to make the All-Star game count. Bud Selig, the commissioner at the time, declared that the league that won the Midsummer Classic would have home field advantage for the World Series. This was a decisive decision that was ultimately overturned 14 years later, mostly because people didn't like the fun exhibition game to be so intense. Additionally, 2 more players were added to each roster, going from 30 players on each team to 32. Thanks to this rule change, especially the home field advantage, managers began to handle the games differently. No longer would it be an everybody plays event. Some other rule changes happened over the following years, and in 2010, the year our unthinkable event happened, the roster sizes had expanded to 34. Additionally, that year, there would be no more pitchers hitting, regardless of whether the game was being played at an NL or an AL park. The DH was de facto. But neither of these rule changes would prompt a manager to select a bench player to the All-Star game. That new rule would be one that contradicts the way baseball is played entirely. Unless you've never seen baseball before, you know that once a player is subbed out, they can't come back into the game. While there had been a rule even before 2002 that allowed re-entry in case of an injured catcher, 2010 changed the rule to allow a regular position player to re-enter in the All-Star game. And in 2010, that player was going to be Omar Infante. See, Infante was a utility player with the Braves. In 2010, he had already played 5 different positions, playing at least 5 games at 4 of them. Infante was the definition of a utility player, and Charlie Manuel might have taken MLB's instructions a little too literally. Before selecting his All-Stars, he had been instructed to choose someone who could play multiple positions. This was to satisfy the new re-entry rule. Manuel must have seen Infante's high batting average and his utility status and chosen him, ignoring guys, starters on their own team mind you, who were probably more deserving, at least by their quality of play, not so much the person. Choosing Infante is obviously absurd. A bench player should never make the All-Star game. But it's also crazy for 2 other reasons. One was that he wasn't even the worst All-Star on the National League, a point that I'll get to in a minute. The other is that a more qualified utility player was already chosen for the All-Star team, and he was Infante's own teammate. Knowing which All-Stars are chosen by managers and which are chosen by players isn't publicly known, but I'm going to go on a limb and guess that Martin Prado was chosen by the players. The Braves' full-time second baseman was in the middle of an incredible year. At the time the All-Stars were announced, Prado was hitting .335 and had 7 more hits than anyone else in the league. And while Prado had played mostly second base in 2010, he had also played some third and first that year. But that was just 2010. From 2006 to 2009, Prado had also had multiple starts at shortstop and in left field, and played right field as well. In fact, he was a Gold Glove finalist 2 years later in left field. He wasn't the Braves' main utility player in 2010 because he didn't need to be. Had Manuel just taken a second to think about the roster, he would have realized that he could have just designated Prado as the break glass in case of emergency guy. Thanks to a Chase Utley injury, Prado was starting too, which meant he would have played the first few innings and been free to come into the game later if necessary. But now let's get to the part that I keep leaving you hanging on. Omar Infante was not the worst All-Star on the National League All-Star team. The worst All-Star was a starter who was actually a product of favoritism, and that was the starting DH and Philly star Ryan Howard. So how was Howard a product of favoritism, and how was he the worst All-Star on the team? I'll get to the first part this time. To quantify the worst All-Star, I'll be using a stat called WAR, specifically Fangraph's version. If you're not familiar with WAR, here's a quick breakdown. It's an all-encompassing stat that takes offense, defense, and base running, at least if you're a hitter, to define how good a player is. A player who has a WAR under 1 throughout the course of the season is seen as a bench player. 2 to 3 WAR players are usually seen as starters, and at roughly 3 or 4 WAR you have a fringe All-Star. At the All-Star break, so a little more than halfway through the season, Omar Infante's WAR was 0.7. If you expand that out to a full season, roughly 150 games, his WAR would have been on pace to be about 1.7, which is about half of what you want an All-Star to be at. But that was far better than Ryan Howard's WAR per 150. At the All-Star break, Ryan Howard's WAR was 0.2 lower than Omar Infante's. This isn't a huge gap until you take into account the games played. See, Infante had only played 63 games to that point. Howard had played 87. Over the course of a full season, Howard's WAR would have still been under 1. Okay, maybe you're a baseball pacifist. You might think that WAR is just being mean to Howard, and you'd be right to think that. After all, he was hitting .295 with 17 homers and 55 RBIs. Even by WRC+, a metric that rates hitters with a base of 100, Ryan Howard was still looking pretty good. So what made him so bad?
It's always defense.
Since War has positional adjustment, with first base being perceived as the easiest position to play, and Howard was absolutely butchering it up at first base. I'll start with a traditionalist stat first. He was leading all first basemen in errors with 14. And if you're a fan of analytics, his defensive rating was negative 23. He was the 4th worst defensive player in the league, and the top 3 weren't first basemen. And yet, he was starting? At this point, you might be saying, but WHP, if Howard was starting, doesn't it mean that fans voted him in, not Charlie Manuel?
Nope.
See, Ryan Howard wasn't starting at first in the All-Star game. That was Albert Pujols. Ryan Howard was starting at DH. And because the National League didn't have any DHs at the time, there were none for the fans to vote in. Instead, the National League manager got to choose which player from the bench he wanted to start at the DH position. And Charlie Manuel chose his own first baseman for the role. I don't even need to assume that Howard was picked because of favoritism either, because Manuel said it himself. Of course, if you're not a fan of analytics, as a frequent commenter of mine is not, you might be saying, hey, Ryan Howard had 17 homers and 55 RBIs. He deserved to be the DH. The DH doesn't even play defense. To which I would also respond,
No, actually.
that year, Albert Pujols started at first base. He was incredible. He hit .308 with 21 homers and 64 RBIs. This was 58% better than league average. Clearly, Pujols was deserving of an All-Star honor. However, Howard wasn't the only other first baseman on the roster. The Reds' first baseman, Joey Votto, was just as good as Pujols. He was hitting an even better .314 and had 22 homers and 60 RBIs. This was good for a 170 WRC+. And yet, despite these numbers, Votto only made the All-Star game thanks to something called the final vote, which allows fans to choose the last bench player. A guy hitting 70% above league average had to fight for an All-Star spot in something called the final vote because the National League manager just liked their own player better. You can easily disagree with me that Ryan Howard was a worse All-Star selection than Omar Infante, but it's a really tough argument that Howard deserved to start in that game over Joey Votto. But back to Infante. After the selection was announced, the pick was absolutely panned, and Charlie's defense was only slightly better than his defense for picking Howard, claiming he was told to pick a utility player. And look, ignoring the fact that Prado was on the team, Infante wasn't a terrible pick for a utility player. The guy was hitting above 300, and he could play 6 of the 8 positions on the field. Charlie Manuel was just doing what he was told. So how did Infante play anyway? Oh,